Friends, sleepers, researchers, lend me your ears. I come to mourn the mixed ingredient teams, not to make war upon the meta's kings. The lists we love, AABs, AACs, are fallen, their glory buried deep in RNG. The mono meta stands triumphant still, and surely it is praised as wise. Mixed lists were bold, they fed both pot and dream. They summoned strength from balance, not from bulk, but now lie dead, unmourned by common talk. For mono reigns, with soybeans stacked in rows, and fancy eggs piled high, devoid of friend. The mono meta let us hear, and yet it is praised as wise. Curries rich with herb and oil and milk, salads with egg and corn, and desserts with ginger. But now, 3 of none, and none of all. The extra tasty crit, that shining star, hath dimmed beneath this sameness. And still, the mono meta is praised as wise. You saw the pot expand, did you not? And yet they filled it not with subtle blends, but thrice repeated leeks or beans or milk. They cried efficiency, they claimed it truth. They fed Snorlax meals of grayest beige. Their dishes did not shine, their stats were plain. Yet lo, the mono meta is praised as wise. I speak not to disprove what all men praise, but I do wonder, had ABC not died, would salads now be as strong as curries are? Would cacao dance with coffee yet again, to craft desserts both rich and resonant? I say but this, the mixed lists were our friends. They brought us joy, but now they are no more. And who hath done this deed? Not I, not you, but the mono meta. O judgment, thou art fled to balanced builds, and men have lost their appetite for mixed. Bear with me now, my heart is in the pot, there with our hopes for synergy and spice, and I must pause till it come back to me. Happy screen time, and thank you for subscribing for Pokémon Sleep Road Tomfoolery. If you've ever hunted for an ingredient specialist, you've likely encountered Pokémon with a great nature and subskills, but the wrong ingredient spread. So the million-dollar question is there any reason to invest in an ingredient Pokémon that is not AAA or ABB? And by the end of this video, you will know how to arrive at that answer for yourself. But in short, I would say that based on my research, the answer is yes for some Pokemon species. There are some key concepts for the mono ingredient meta that we want to keep in mind. First, getting an ingredient that you need when you need it is much better than getting ingredients that you don't need. Second, typically when assessing a Pokemon's performance in this meta, a player should consider what is the highest quantity of an ingredient that I might need in a particular day. To arrive at this, you look at the max ingredient count that is required on any meal, and then you multiply that number by 3, assuming you make that meal 3 times in a day. Third, part of the idea behind the mono ingredient meta is future-proofing your account. If you find an ingredient specialist that produces large amounts of a particular ingredient, even if a new dish gets released that requires that ingredient, you should be pretty set. But there is a problem, and it's coming in 3, 2, 1. Realistically, you're picking a single Pokemon of a particular species and running with it, or a single Pokemon between multiple forms like Vulpix and Alolan Vulpix. If you're playing a relatively balanced game, you likely won't have the resources to invest in 2 of the same Pokemon species. And because you're picking the best of what you have, typically players would recommend that for an ingredient specialist, you continue hunting until you find a good AAA or ABB ingredient list Pokemon. But what happens when you catch AAB, AAC, ABC, ABA. I did do it without looking. What if you get one of those spreads and it has an incredible nature and set of subskills? Is it still worth investing? And that's where being a subscriber of this channel finally pays off for you, because I think I've come up with a pretty good way to evaluate these Pokemon. And if you're not subscribed, please let this be the video that earns your subscription. I'm just a fan of the game, trying to help other players, and a channel subscription is the best way you can show your support for that. Thank you for help making this worth my while. I appreciate it. Before we get to an actual analysis of an actual Pokemon, we need to lay some groundwork. The first thing we're going to do is abandon the idea that we are going to consistently make the same meal 3 times a day every day. Maybe if you're able to do that with all of the strongest meals, you're already doing that. But I find that even with having especially strong ingredient specialists, I still have to fall back to lower meals sometimes. Whether it's because of RNG or because of days when I can't rotate in the right Pokemon, but I'm often evaluating what is the least amount of ingredients that I need to make the best possible dish next. Because the less time my ingredient specialists are on the field, the more time I have to run my Golduck, my Ampharos, or a berry specialist. And I'm starting to find that when I'm picking from among those options, meaning these non-ingredient specialists, I'm often considering not the favorite berry, but I will select one of those based on which one will contribute most to the passive ingredient collection that will be most beneficial for me. Now, I say passive because typically the ingredient quantity isn't super reliable from these mons, but if I'm able to get ingredients from these Pokemon, it means that they're able to contribute outside of their typical role. I am also doing this with my healers. I have an exceptional Gardevoir and Wigglytuff, and when I need apples, Gardevoir's in. When I need oil or cacao, Wigglytuff is in. And you are going to find that using non-ingredient Pokemon for ingredients will likely become even more of a strategic priority as you get these Pokemon to level 60. It's like they become a level 30 ingredient specialist at that point. So what if we redefined how we talk about ingredient specialists? As an early day player, I am just now starting to get multiple level 60 ingredient mons. And with some experience here, let me offer how I think we should shift how we treat these Pokemon. Unlike berry Pokemon and skill Pokemon, an ingredient specialist goes through somewhat of an evolution throughout its lifespan. From level 1 to 29, its only ingredient is its primary role. Then, at level 30, when it unlocks that second slot, the second ingredient becomes its primary ingredient, and its first ingredient becomes the secondary ingredient. And this shift happens again at level 60. The third ingredient becomes the primary ingredient, the second ingredient becomes the secondary ingredient, and we could call the third ingredient the tertiary ingredient, but at this point I would just call it passive production. The ingredient quantities of the third and second slot are much higher typically than that first slot, which is always 2. So unless you have an A ingredient in the second or third slot, you should just consider that first slot as passive production. Again, I give this as my opinion. This means that as you level up your ingredient specialist, unless it is that mono AAA list, it is changing its role at level 30, and it is changing its role again at level 60. Also keep in mind that with RNG, when an ingredient is found, you have the same odds as getting the ingredient in slot 1, 2, or 3. But over the course of weeks, months, decades, centuries, this all balances out. Where this gets especially interesting is ingredient quantities. Just as a berry specialist differs by having an additional berry, what sets an ingredient specialist apart is not its ingredient rate, rather it's the quantity of ingredients that come when it finds ingredients. And these quantities are what make the ingredient spreads quite nuanced, so you can't make a hard and fast rule about any of these mixed spreads. And this might be another reason why the mono ingredient meta is so popular, and that's because it's way simpler to understand. Let's take the AAC spread as an example here. For example, at level 60, some ingredient specialists produce more of the C ingredient than of the A ingredient. Some species will produce these in equal quantities, and other species will produce more of the A ingredient than the C ingredient. Ultimately, the ingredient quantities are what matter because That's what affects whether or not you can make the meal you're trying to make. All of this to say that the second and third slots are the reason to be running your ingredient specialist. And one reminder, everything I've been talking about this way is unaffected by nature and subskills. The nature and subskill combinations will determine how often when a Pokemon helps that it finds berries or ingredients. Once it selects to find ingredients, it does an additional roll to choose slot 1, 2, or 3. So the only control that you have over whether that 1, 2, or 3 slot is used is the level that you keep your Pokemon at. So it might be advantageous for your overall team to leave a Pokemon at level 29 or level 59 because its role might change and disrupt your account unless you have that AAA option. I did touch on it briefly earlier, but we have to assume that we are not always going to make the same meal 3 times a day. There are some single meal synergy opportunities out there with mixed lists, but this means you're kind of ignoring the ingredients produced by all of the other Pokemon on your team, which over time is going to be higher quantities. So ideally, you're somewhat allowing RNG to determine what meals you're making and where you're focusing your dishes. Now, if you intend to cook the same meal 21 times in a week, sure, stick to the mono ingredient meta or some variation that works synergistically for you. I mean, okay, I think that there's still going to be a case for you 21 mealer people. The point is, there is more strength to be gained from using a variety of specialists, including your berry and skill specialist, along with your ingredient specialist, while still making as strong of meals as you can. You might be able to make up not making the strongest dish, but settling for the second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth or ninth, but making up that strength with a charge strength M Pokemon. So I would propose that the ingredient meta is not about how much of a particular ingredient that your ingredient specialist can produce. Rather, it is about the dishes that are in the game, and then layered into that, how you use a combination of berry specialists, skill specialists, and ingredient specialists to make the strongest meal you can. And now, armed with a common understanding of these principles, we are now ready to evaluate what some call the bad ingredient spreads. So the question we need to be answering for any ingredient Pokemon is, can we use this spread to target multiple meals? And if we're producing a passive ingredient or some quantity of an ingredient we don't need, are we producing so many that they would be wasted? So to start this assessment, I grabbed this chart from Anti and I changed it visually to help me bring attention to which meals use the ingredients produced by this ingredient specialist. And going through this exercise made me realize one more thing. By the time you raise an ingredient specialist to level 60, you are likely targeting the late game meals. And for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to define late game as 40 ingredients or more in the pot. Sorry, Neroli's tea. And while we're throwing out definitions, we'll call anything less than 20 ingredients an early game meal, and anything in between we'll call mid game. So I determined to look at each species by ingredient spread at various levels and at various stages of the game, and for each meal type. And that ends up being a lot of work, so we're going to start with 3 of them today, the 3 that are most important for this week for you. And I'm not going to read through all my charts and stuff, but I'm just going to draw your attention to what I think is most interesting here. And if you're watching this video and it's not the Prelude event right now, that's another reason you should subscribe so that you don't miss future videos that could have timely effects on your playing. And before I get into the analysis, one more invitation. If there is a particular ingredient Pokemon that you would like me to assess in an upcoming video, please let me know in the comments. And if somebody else shared the one that you want to see, put a like on their comment. Let me know. There's a lot of interest for this Pokemon. Comment again, give it more votes, give it more likes. I want to make sure that I bring the most relevant of these scenarios to you guys because it does take a little bit of work to arrive at these conclusions. So whatever you guys tell me you want to see next is going to determine what we follow up with here. Let's start with Meowscarada, which includes Sprigatito and Floragato, of course. You can assume we're always talking about the whole line. In the early game, potatoes do not have a clear place in the meta. At level 30, either AA or AB work really well for salads, AA is really helpful for curries, and there's less synergy in the other scenarios. Interestingly enough, for Meowscarada, the only ingredient spread that has high synergy across all of the meal types is ABC. AAA and ABA have high synergy for curries and salads late game. AAB has high synergy for curries and desserts, and AAB and AAC both work only best for salads in the late game. So this assessment here, as I'm saying what has high synergy, is looking at, is there a scenario where these ingredients get used? It's not so much, is this the best thing you can have? It's more, is there a place where this ingredient spread fits? Is there a scenario where it works? Let's dig a little deeper on Meowscarada and this ABC spread for curries. This spread works because the ginger can go to Inferno Keema Corn Curry, and the potatoes and milk can go to Dream Eater Butter Curry. But because you're only getting 2 potatoes at a time, you're likely going to need to supplement those potatoes somehow. So we could call this medium synergy, but I opted to call it high because the potatoes that come from Meowscarada still have a clear place to go. But likely, you'll overproduce the milk you need in that scenario, and I think it's worth noting that 3 triggers of the C ingredient ginger will cover 2 instances of Keema Corn Curry's ginger requirement. So most likely, you're trying to hit that requirement and then saving up the other ingredients to use Dream Eater Butter Curry as a backup meal. Maybe for when your pot expander is misbehaving. RNG. Now compare the complexity of that scenario with the simplicity of salads. 3 findings of milk in the second slot from a Meowscarada covers the requirement for apple acid yogurt dress salad. And while 3 findings of the first slot grants you only 6 potatoes, and it doesn't get you any particular meal, there are lots of places for those potatoes to potentially land. So with that ABC spread, you could consistently make the apple acid yogurt dress salad and use ginger for the ninja salad consistently, and then passively stockpile potatoes, ideally for Defiant dressed coffee salad, but potentially for Petal Blizzard layered salad or green grass salad, which that seems like such a boring name now. But the point being, depending on how other ingredient production is coming along, there's still a place for those potatoes to go. But you can see where all of those other ingredient spreads, AAB, AAC, ABA, also have a clear place if we're thinking about it this way, for salads. So I've labeled these both as high, but we could say that there's better synergy for salads than for curries for an ABC Meowscarada. But if you're raising an ABC Meowscarada, it's not like you're gonna say, well, I only run this for salads, unless you have other ingredient specialists, mixed or mono, to cover you during your curries week. So it's worth looking at how these ingredient spreads operate in the multitude of these scenarios. Let's move on to look at Skeledirge. Apples have a clear place in the early game. They are actually the only ingredient that have a single ingredient meal in all meal types. So by running a Fuecoco, I guess, you could consistently make those apple meals in the early game. But also, I guess a Fuecoco is a lot slower than a Skeledirge, and in the early game you have low levels, so, well, it's going to be a good option still. When we look at Skeledirge at level 30, an AA list in the mid game does not really help with curries, and an AB list in the mid game does not help with desserts. And in the late game, that situation doesn't get any better for either of those. Of all of the Paldean starters, Skeledirge is actually the one with the least versatility. AAA works really well for salads and desserts in the late game, and ABB works for curries and for salads, but AAB or ABA only have high synergy for salads, while ABC only has high synergy for curries. And unfortunately for Skeledirge, AAC does not really work well for anything in the meta right now. Interestingly, Skeledirge became relevant for the late game salads only because of the recently added apple acid yogurt dressed salad, which I've now said so many times in this video that I don't think I'll forget the name of it anymore. Before that, only ABB was a synergistic late game Skeledirge strategic play. It's worth noting that at the rate that recipes get added to the game, your Pokemon should only ever get better and more synergistic because there will be more complexity and more opportunities for these things to work across the meal types. That said, we have seen one instance where the meals were actually adjusted, where the soybean counts and the strength of some of those soybean meals were adjusted just before Quaquaval was added to the game. So one time in the last 2 years we did see a rebalancing, but that's 1 day out of 365 times 2. That never happens. So don't let future viability be a reason that you hold back on one of these specialists. And speaking of Quaquaval, here's a fun fact. At every level and with any ingredient spread, Quaquaval is highly synergistic for salads. Curries are also highly synergistic for Quaquaval, well, beginning at level 30, but if it has that oil in its third slot, it becomes less synergistic at level 60. And finally, the only ingredient spread that has high synergy for Quaquaval for late game desserts is ABB. And that makes ABB the only ingredient spread that works with high synergy for Quaquaval across all 3 meal types. Please note that the contents of what I just shared with you are likely to change when new recipes are added to the game that take these into effect, but like I said, it should only make them more viable in theory. Well, more or stay the same. I am very open to feedback about this approach as I am just exploring this myself and trying it out with different Pokemon. So let me know about the implications of this from your perspective. Is this a worthwhile endeavor or not? And of course, hopefully I've now given you a system by which you can evaluate these Pokemon for yourself if you don't want to wait for me to get to one in a video. But let me know if this system resonates with you or if you see something that I'm not seeing. And as a benefit for watching this far to the end of the video, let me share with you one more tip. And that is that I think the mono ingredient meta is still a very effective way to play the game, but you might think of mono ingredient collection or reliable ingredient collection as phase 1 of a long-term ingredient strategy. Considering where mixed lists could come into play is good for a phase 2 of your ingredient strategy, because you wouldn't want to go all in on a bunch of mixed ingredient specialists and then not be able to get ingredients that you need. The idea here is that you can run an ingredient specialist and collect for multiple meals, and depending on which way that seems to be going, put in the ingredient specialists that are reliable for the ingredients that you need to actually finish off those meals. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe. Let's do this again sometime. Happy researching.